Hey guys, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is Ankush here from Alif Consulting. Welcome in our Azure Migrate video. In this video, we will be going to talk about how we can actually perform a test migration or the actual migration of the VM from GCP to Azure. In our last video, what we understood how we can install or configure the replication appliance and the configuration server and how we can enable the replication of a VM, right? So once the replication is completed, we have two options here. The first one is to do the test migration, and the other second one is to do the full migration. Well, here is the agenda of our all the videos which we have completed in previously, or what we are going to complete in this video. So this is going to conclude our migration of Azure migration video from GCP to Azure. So in our last or our previous videos, what we learned the discovery part, we learned the assessment part, and we learned the migration part where we set up the replication appliance and the configuration server to replicate the VM from GCP to Azure, right? So in our last video, what we did, we prepare the GCP instance, we prepare the Azure site, Azure Migrate project. We add the Azure migration tool, right? We install the mobility agent, we set up the replication agent, we enable the replications, right? Or we enable the replication of the VM from Azure to GCP, right? So once the replication is completed and the VM is fully protected at the Azure site, we have a now capability to do the migration, right? So when you're doing the migration, you cannot simply go ahead and migrate the VM, right? That something is not possible when you are running the production workload, right? To do that, first what you need to do, you need to perform each and every testing of your all the VMs which has been migrated to Azure from GCP, right? So to do that, we have an option in Azure called a test failover, right? Test failover allow us to do the testing of the image which replicated into the Azure based on the last register point available, right? The second option which we have is run a full migration, right? So the full migration allow us to simply migrate the whole VM from the snapshot, from the latest snapshot, and to create that VM into the Azure, right? At the same time, keep in mind your VMs in GCP would not be going to be impacted in that case, right? So once you have migrated your VM, your VMs are still going to be available in the GCP. You can still use them in there to validate all your datas. However, once your VMs is migrated into Azure, you want to use Azure VMs in actual, you might need to do some changes at the network level, at the DNS level, or maybe on a other infrastructure level also to have your application up and running directly from the Azure VM, right? So let's simply jump into the demo and understand how we can run a test failover or how we can run a full migration, right? So I am logging in my GCP console and you can see all of my VMs are up and running here. So this is the VM in our previous video which we have replicated to the Azure using the replication appliance and the configuration server. We have the mobility agent installed on this VM, right? Now if you go into the Azure and if you go into the Azure Migrate project, you would be able to see you have a one VM which is replicated, right? So if you click on this VM from here, you would be able to see what is the replication status, what is the replication health, or what are the other migration status or the test migration status we have. Sorry. Now, if you click on this VM, you would have further options, right? So what kind of further options you have? You have options to perform the failover, you have options to perform the test failover, you have options to stop the replications, right? And then you have options to change the compute network or the disk setting, right? So if you go here, if you click on this one, you would have all the options related to the compute and networks, right? So let's take an example. We want to change the VM network configuration, right? Let's take an example. We want to change the availability set, we want to change the VM size, right? So all of those things we can directly change from here also, right? At the same time, if you want to change the disk replications or you want to add or remove the any disk from the replication, that's something you can do into the disk configuration, right? So that's how you can do the configuration changes of a VM which is basically replicating from GCP to Azure or from the other cloud, right? Now, as I told you, we have two options to perform the migration. One is the call a test migration, and another one call is the actual migration, right? So for to do the test migration, this is the option which is there. Now, as soon as you click on the test migration, right, it's going to ask you for the few information which you need to add, right? You need to select the virtual network and you need to click on test migration, right? So as soon as you've done the test migration, it's going to create a VM from the last available snapshot as a test VM, where it's going to have a test at the end of the VM name, and then you can basically log into that VM and see if that VM is successfully running into the Azure, right? If you find there is any issues or anything which is not running or not up to the mark, then you can clean up this test migration. You can basically stop this migration from here, and you can simply start working on the issues or maybe fixing those issues as the GCP VM, and then you can replicate, and then those changes will be replicated to Azure automatically, and then you can again do the test migration, right? So if you click on this test migration, you would be able to see, if you click on the notification of the test migration, you would be able to see what exactly is happening, right? So it's validating all the prerequisites, it's performing the test failover, now it's creating the VM, right? At the same time, if you open a duplicate tab of the Azure portal and you click on all the resources from here, you would be able to see what kind of resources this test migration is creating, right? So you can see this is the VM, this is the disk, right, which has been created by this test failover, right? So this test failover job has been successfully completed here, and the other tab, if you go, we can see this is the VM which has been successfully created by the test failover job. Now if you see, we don't have any public IP associated with this VM, which means we would not be able to connect it, right? To do that, what we can do, we can simply go into the NIC and we can assign the public IP directly from here, right? So from here we need to go into the NIC config, we need to associate, click on new. Let me go ahead and create a new public IP. It's just validating the name, and click on OK and click on save, right? So now it is doing it, it's creating a new IP. Since there's no IP is available, the public IP is not available in my subscription, it have assigned the public IP, and then from there I can use that IP to log into the virtual machine, right? And if you remember in our last video, what we did, we have created a one user called admin user. So we're going to use that users to log in into this VM, right? So let's wait for this uh, configurations to be get updated, and as soon as this configuration is updated, we would be able to move forward, and we will be able to connect with the VM using the RDP. Now you can see the public IP is successfully associated with this VM. Now let's go ahead and click on connect and click on RDP, and this will be going to allow us to download the RDP file. We can go ahead and open this RDP file, and at the same time it's going to ask me for the credentials, right? So as I told you, I already have a user created, so I will be going to use that user to log in into this VM. So it's taking a little time to connect with this VM. So yeah, let's wait for this to get connected, and then from there we would be able to go inside the VM. Else if this credential would not work, we can go ahead and create the new credentials for this VM directly from the Azure portal also. All right, looks like the connection is not working. Let me go ahead and cancel this one. Let me go back into the uh, Azure portal. Uh, okay, the input security in the security rule. Okay. However, okay, uh, looks like there is a something wrong. All right, so my interface does not have any inbound rules, but I don't think I have any NSGs associated with this one. But this is the public IP. This is the NIC. This is the VM. And if I go into the network, yes, I don't have any network security group, which means I can simply go ahead and log in on this VM without any issue. So it's checking this one. Let me go ahead and download one more time. Yes, so this time it's successfully allowing me to log in into the VM. So it's configuring the remote PC now, and after that, I would be successfully able to go inside the VM. All right. So finally, I am inside the VM, and once I log into this VM, what I can do, I can perform all the all the checks, all the tests, every validations, every pre-checks which I need to require to run before moving this machine into the Azure, right? So that's something you can do in this failover, right? So as I told you, this is a failover test failover, which means if we are doing any changes in this VM or in this virtual machine from the RDP or by logging into this, by doing the application, anything that would not going to impact on your actual snapshot or actual replication, right? So once you log in this VM, you can do everything, right? And you can see I'm successfully able to log in into this VM, right? So this is the test failover, and this is how you can run a test failover for Azure VM, right? So let's close this remote session. Let's go back to the portal. Now this is how you can perform the test failover, right? So once your test failover is done, what is the next step, right? So next step is to clean up your test failovers because our work is done. Now for do that, to clean up the test failover, what we need to do, we need to go into the replicated VM, right? We need to click on the VM which we have on which we have performed the test failover, and then what we can do, we can simply go ahead and do the cleanup, right? So there is the option called cleanup test failover, right? So if you click on this one, you can say my testing is completed, and you can put the comment whatever you want to do and clean up test failover. Now as soon as you click on it one, what exactly it's going to do, it's going to delete all the resources like a VM, like a disk, like a NIC, whatever the resources has been created by this test failover, right? So if you click on this task or in this test cleanup job, you would be able to see what exactly is happening, right? So it's ending the test failover. Now it's cleaning up the virtual machine. So whatever the virtual machine which has been created here, it's now cleaning that specific virtual machines, right? So once the virtual machine is clean up, or the test failover is clean up, we would be able to move forward and we would be able to do the actual failover, right? And at the same time, if you go into the GCP portal, you would see your VM is still up and running. There is no issue with this VM. You can simply go into this VM and see all the metrics and available metrics on the GCP side, right? Which means this test failover or the actual failover which we are going to do after the cleanup of this test failover is not impacting on the actual VM which is on the GCP side. Right? So let's wait for this to get completed, then only we would be able to move forward. In the meanwhile, if you see, your disk VM is deleted, right? Your disk is still there, your NIC is still there. However, all of these things would be removed by this test failover cleanup job. Now you can see the disk is also cleaned up, right? There's no longer disk is available. Meanwhile, let me go ahead and do one thing. Let me remove the public IP which I have associated with this VM, this NIC, specifically the VM of the NIC. However, looks like the NIC is also removed, right? So NIC is also removed. Now we don't have any of the resources like the disk, the VM, and the NIC, which has been created by the test failover, right? So once your test failover clean up, now what is the next step? The next step is to do the actual failover, right? So as soon as you do the cleanup of your test failover, you have a plenty of other options available, right? You have options to do the migration, you have an option to do the stop replication, you have an option to do the uh, or do the or a check or do the any kind of checks like delete the VM, delete the application, delete the snapshot. All of those options would be available once your cleanup is done, right? So now I do have a stop replication, I do have a migration option, and I do have a test migration, right? So first of all, before going into this VM, let me go ahead and change or resize the VM, because the size of the VM which has been assigned by Azure Migrate project is very less. So I just want to give it a more CPU and more memory so that I can get a better performance. So yes, let me give it at least 2 core. Alright, I think this would be enough. 2 core 16 GB memory would be enough for this. So yes, let's save this one, and let's get this changes to be updated into the configuration, and then we'll move forward and we'll do the actual failover, right? So the reason of changing this one is like the performance which we are not getting up to the mark. Even in our GCP VM, in our previous video when we are installing the mobility agent, the performance was not up to the mark, hence I have updated the size of VM. Now let's go ahead and do the actual failover, right? To do that, what we need to do, we need to click on overview and click on migration. Now it's asking you, do you want to shut down the virtual machines before doing the minimum data loss? I would say no, because I don't have an option to click on yes, right? Because for the physical and the virtual machine from the other cloud does not have a capability to automatically stop the VM, right? So I need to just click on no and click on migration. So as soon as you clicked on a migration, all the configurations like a compute, like a network, like a disk which has been there into the VM configuration would be used to do the actual failover, right? So once you click on the migration, or you go into the notification and click on the migration task, you would be able to see all the plenty of things which this actual migration job is doing it, like validation of prerequisites, validation of the snapshots, shutting down the machine, syncing the latest changes, right, doing the failover, starting the replication VM. All of those things would be done by this failover job. Now if you go into the portal or into the another tab, you would be able to see it will be going to create a VM, it's going to create a NIC, it's going to create a disk. However, this time all of these resources is not going to have a test at the end of the resource name, right? Since this is actual failover, this is not a test failover, so it's going to be uh, look like an actual VM and not going to have any kind of test in the naming syntax, right? So you can see the disk has been successfully created, right? If you go into the other tab, you can still see the job is in a still progress, right? And meanwhile, if you go into the other tab and you do the refresh, you would be able to see it's creating a new resource. Now this time it have also created a NIC and it have also created the VM. Now if you click on this VM is in a running state. This VM would be going to show you the running state. However, we still need to wait to failover job to be get completed, right? Now you can see my failover job is successfully completed, right? So now let's go back to the VM, assign the public IP of this public IP to this VM, because we don't have any public IP assigned, and we need to have a public IP assigned to this VM to get connected over the RDP, because we don't have any private connectivity to the virtual network in which this VM is deployed, right? So go to the IP configuration, go to the the IP configuration here, and here assign the public IP, right? So as soon as you assign the public IP, go back to your virtual machine, and you would be able to see the public IP is now available to this VM, right? So you need to give it a few minutes. So this is the public IP which has been there, and now let's go ahead and click on RDP, and then from here we can download the RDP file and we can connect this VM, right? So it's going to ask me for the credentials of this VM for the RDP session, and then from there we would be able to log in this VM. So it's initiating a time. Most probably we might need to re-download the file one more time. Okay, it says not able to connect with the remote system. Great. Go back to the VM. Okay, the configuration of NIC has been successfully saved. Okay, let's go back and try to do the RDP one more time. Now before doing it to RDP, let's see if we have any uh, network security group associated with this VM. So we don't have any network security group associated with VM, which means there's a no security rules is there which is blocking the connection. So yeah, let's go ahead and do the RDP connection one more time, download the RDP file and see if that's work this time. All right, so it's now asking me for the credentials. Since this is the first time VM is booting, once the migration is completed, it's just taking a little bit of time to go inside the VM, right? So once you log in into the VM, or once your migration is done, you would be successfully able to RDP the VM. You would be able to perform everything inside the VM, right? So to do the validation, you would be able to see a one shortcut of Google Cloud shell command from shell on the desktop, which confirm this VM has been migrated from the GCP, right? So this is the shell, and this confirms like this is coming from the GCP, right? So that's how you can do the actual migration or actual failover of a GCP VM to the Azure, right? At the same time, if you go into the GCP console, you would see your VM is still running there. There is no changes in the VM at the GCP side, right? Which means your VM is available at the both side, and you can still validate or do the validation of your data at the both side.